Hi, I'm Hadar Hazony,
And I'm Titus Techera.
and this is Transvaluation, a series of conversations dedicated to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil.
This is our second episode. We have already covered the preface in our debut, along with an explanation of what our studies are and why we're studying this and why you should be studying it along with us. We should add to that, we are reading the Kaufman translation because it's quite beautiful, and he was the man who legitimated Nietzsche in American academia, which we're attempting to do again for a new century. Today we're going to be talking about the Prejudices of the Philosophers, the first part, but we will only be going through about a quarter of it, the first 5 aphorisms. All right, Hadar, let's do this.
Okay, so section 1 on the Prejudices of Philosophers. The will to truth, which will still tempt us to many a venture, that famous truthfulness of which all philosophers so far have spoken with respect. What questions has this will to truth not laid before us? What strange, wicked, questionable questions? That is a long story even now, and yet it seems as if it has scarcely begun. Is it any wonder that we should finally become suspicious, lose patience, and turn away impatiently? That we should finally learn from this Sphinx to ask questions too? Who is it really that puts questions to us here? What in us really wants truth? Indeed, we came to a long halt at the question about the cause of this will, until we finally came to a complete stop before a still more basic question. We asked about the value of this will. Suppose we want truth, why not rather untruth and uncertainty, even ignorance? The problem of the value of truth came before us. Or was it we who came before the problem? Who of us is Oedipus here? Who the Sphinx? It is a rendezvous, it seems, of questions and question marks. And though it scarcely seems credible, it finally almost seems to us as if the problem had never even been put so far, as if we were the first to see it, fix it with our eyes, and risk it, for it does involve a risk, and perhaps there is none that is greater.
So the will to truth sounds like a replacement for the classical Greek word philosophy. Philosophy is love of wisdom. Will is not the same thing as love, the philos in philosophia, the philein. And of course, truth is not quite the same as Sophia, although they're very connected. Will to truth seems to be Nietzsche's replacement for philosophy, and he begins to explain why that is. But if it's some kind of replacement for a correlative of philosophy, it has to achieve, in a way, the same thing. Philosophy is a word that is supposed to suggest the unity of being human. The will to truth is supposed to do that as well. And nevertheless, there's a certain complexity to the problem. Man today does not have unity. His lack of unity is the product of enlightenment, really. The will to truth has led philosophers into a kind of alliance with mankind through truthfulness. Truthfulness is commonly considered a virtue or something like an adjutant of virtue. It's something that the people who are dedicated to knowledge, scientists or philosophers, have in common with ordinary people who are dedicated to other things than knowledge, but who also think of truthfulness as an important thing or a virtue. So you could look at it intellectually, knowing the truth, or morally, a willingness to say the truth. But it's what the rarest of the rare, the knowers, have in common with ordinary people who are not as such knowers or interested in knowledge. That's some kind of unity of mankind, but it could also be called simply enlightenment, as the world historical picture of the preface told us. The philosophers have led mankind. And nevertheless, we have to ask ourselves, where have we been led? To what have we been led? The time has come, Nietzsche claims, to be suspicious of enlightenment. And therefore to become aware of questions and in their questionability. Enlightenment is a little like going to school. Any question that comes up, there's an answer. The moment you get your answer, you forget there ever was a question. If you ask yourself, when I was a kid and I learned basic arithmetics, geometry, what was that like? What was it like not to know, to have those questions? Nobody knows. Just whatever you can ask me in math that I know, I'll just give you the answer. I don't know what it's like not to know. I don't know where those questions went, but it turns out when you get an answer, the questions disappear. The questionableness of things is part of the price we have paid without realizing it for enlightenment. We have answers, or studies show anything you'd like. And you maybe believe it and you don't, you might be more interested or less interested, but escaping in your own mind, so to speak, that authority, there are answers everywhere and questions are basically inconceivable, is a very difficult situation. But that, Nietzsche claims, is the beginning. That is the beginning that we have to make, and it's a kind of new beginning. He says it's a long story, but in a way it has scarcely begun. That long story is the story of enlightenment, of philosophers leading mankind through the ages, but it's also scarcely begun because a new beginning is necessary, or put otherwise, because we have not learned what we think we have learned. We have not achieved what we think we have achieved by way of knowledge, and above all of self-knowledge. The radicalism of beyond good and evil starts with this question. What is it really that puts questions to us? What is the will to truth? Why are we this way? And you can look at that structurally if you think about the sequence he gives you: truth, untruth, uncertainty, ignorance. Truth and untruth have certainty together, which becomes obvious once he adds uncertainty. You could be right, you could be wrong, with certainty. Uncertainty is something else. But also certainty, with or without truth, and uncertainty have something in common that separates them from ignorance, and that is awareness of the problem. So you get a structure of the faculties of the mind, of the soul, as we used to say, and you get a kind of progression from ignorance to truth through stages. But the rhetoric almost entirely conceals this structure of of your interiority. He seems to be saying we should be going backwards. We should be going to the beginning, if you will, to the origin, which must have been ignorance. Of course, in a way, it's funny, we are ignorant of our origins. We are ignorant of the questions. We think we know the answers. And so, in fact, for us, progressing towards ignorance is progress in the literal sense of recovering the true path. It would mean overcoming the prejudices of enlightenment, the prejudices of the philosophers. To recover ignorance is to be in the fundamental situation again, and that fundamental situation is incredibly risky. I should say a word about the questioning itself too. The questions can be questionable themselves. Questions can be evil. You could take an intellectual or a moral objection to being asked questions. Those questions presuppose or at least suggest your ignorance or your moral failures. They also can force you to look at yourself that way. If somebody poses a question to which you do not have an answer, you might come to see yourself through the position implied by that question as morally or intellectually deficient. There is therefore, so to speak, danger for everyone involved. But so you could see why people might not want to face questions. You could say that every question implies insults, if not is an insult. But at a more fundamental level, it's the point is that, especially when you look to the practical questions that you ask yourself for other people all day, every day, and you get an answer and you act on that answer and you move on with life. If you ever stop to examine them, you see that every practical question implies a lot of theoretical answers. You could see it if you pull up your smartphone and ask an app to solve a problem for you, get you food, get you driving somewhere, achieve something. To have an answer to that practical question, how do I get such and such a thing, or how do I get to such and such a place? There are all of these other technical answers that have to be set into place as an app. But this is simply true of how you orient yourself in the world. You must have some assumptions about the earth and the heavens and so on and so forth, just to walk one foot in front of the other wherever it is that you're going. The questioning leads to something like an abyss. It's like asking yourself, why do I believe that if I put one foot in front of the other, everything's going to be fine? And so there is a certain attraction, but also a certain danger to beginning with question and with the will to truth, questioning it. What is its value? What is its source? Why are we this way? The danger consists in undermining the constructive character of all our practical affairs, of all our technical arrangements, and of our beliefs. So it seems like the moment when Nietzsche begins to build something, he will be making a case, as we'll see, especially obvious in the beginning of the first part here, an analysis of what it means to be human, what is its relationship to knowledge, what is the tension between knowledge and life. All of these things are articulated through these questions. But also, everything about our way of life is in the process being undermined. That is the meaning of the prejudices of the philosophers. Another way of saying prejudices of the philosophers would be to say the air you breathe, the mental atmosphere, the moral atmosphere, everything you take for granted just so that you can go on with life, the way you look at people, the way you look at yourself, the kind of thoughts that come to you when you're in trouble and you need consolation or advice. That could simply be said as the prejudices of the philosophers, since they are the source of the beliefs and of the enlightenment. All of that seems to be at stake. All of that seems to be in danger of being destroyed, even as Nietzsche begins to construct his own analysis.
You said that the philosophers, in a sense, were the leaders, and that Western philosophy has brought us somewhere, right? And the assumption since the time of Plato is that truth is good, perhaps the highest good. That is the essential assumption of philosophers. And so every time a philosopher asks a question, there is this assumption that the answer, not only, as you said, we go to school and we are taught to believe that there are answers to all the questions and that we need to have the answers, but that the answer is beneficial, that it is good. That is the assumption. That's the fundamental assumption since the time of Plato. And so it becomes a kind of dogma that there is an answer and that the answer is good, and it is good for you to know the answer. These become essentially assumptions of thought for philosophers. And as we saw in the preface, Nietzsche is trying to escape dogmatism as a problem. How can you think your way or ask your way out of the assumption that asking is good? It seems impossible, because if you were to ask a question about that, then you're already asking. So you're making the same assumption, aren't you? And so Nietzsche, he pulls one of his signature moves, which is an inversion. He's not directly departing from the tradition, but standing it on its head. And he says, well, what if we ask a question about asking questions? What is the truth of asking for truth? And more importantly, what is the value of it? Now, as far as the will being a unity, I mean, I read that more in the opposite way. I don't know what you'll think about this, that setting it as a will for truth or will to truth implies that there are other wills. So we haven't yet gotten to the full formulation of the will to power, which only happens later in Beyond Good and Evil. but the will to life and other kinds of wills we have seen in Nietzsche. And so I read it almost as related to drive theory. This is one of the drives that we have, and it takes away the paramount or the ultimate nobility, the ultimate value of the will to truth, or at least it sets a question. We have an assumption that this thing is valuable. Values, of course, are extremely important to Nietzsche. We assume that this thing is above other things and that we would sacrifice other things for this thing. But why? Why do we make this assumption? Will it turn out that this thing is actually not worth as much as other people think it is? And, the question here is, who really is the Sphinx? Is the Sphinx the will to truth? Is the Sphinx Socrates, who asks us these questions, but really turns out that he's a lion and he's trying to eat us? Um, is the Sphinx Nietzsche? It's not so clear. But we do find ourselves in a situation where the second we ask questions about our questioning instinct, and we say, why do I do this? It reformulates our relationship to our own thought. And in a way, that's what Nietzsche was saying in the preface, where he says we need to be more serious about our thought. This desire to know, this drive to know, this inclination, let us not take it for granted. And presumably, if you're reading this book, you have a desire to know. Very few people who don't have a desire to know would be reading this book. So you have to stop and ask yourself, why am I reading this book? What is the point of this? What do I think I'm going to get out of it? Will I really get out of it what I think I'm going to get out of it? And these are things that philosophers, if you know any, don't tend to ask. They make a lot of they make a big deal out of questioning cognition and asking, oh, how does cognition work? And how does philosophy work? And how does epistemology work? And how can we really know what we know? And there's a whole lot of conversation about what truth is and how we know it. Not a lot of questions of why are you interested in this question? Is it kind of blindness? Like you said, a lack of self-awareness. Why are you engaged in this activity? What does it do for you? What are you getting from it? And I think Nietzsche is saying, if we're going to do this non-dogmatically, that's the first thing we have to ask is, why are we doing this?
Yeah, Oedipus before the Sphinx is supposed to face the question to which the answer is man. It's the question of self-knowledge. And of course, the Sphinx is a woman, like the truth in the preface. So that's one part of the image he uses. It's a question of self-knowledge. Of course, the other part of it is it's a tragic image. The way in which Oedipus comes to think that he knows what man is and can build a political science on top of it, so to speak, i.e. to legitimate his rule, he becomes king by answering that he knows what is man. That leads to a tragedy. That I think is very much in keeping with what you were saying about the problem of dogmatists. Oedipus before the Sphinx is primarily a dogmatist. Indeed not a subtle or successful wooer of that deadly woman. And that, you could say, was a beginning. It's a mythical or beginning from a tragedy, but it speaks to the beginning of facing the question of knowledge, is facing the question, what is man? The practical form of knowledge always comes around to saying what life is worth living. And why would you be reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil? Because he claims somehow to know the answer to that question. And therefore, if you follow along and can follow, then you might learn Nietzsche's answer to that question. And that indeed is something much more impressive than what passes for philosophy under the conditions of modern science. This is not parlor tricks. This is not people playing with words. If you're playing with anything, it's you're playing with your life and with mankind's cosmic destiny. And those are much higher stakes. All right, let's get to aphorism.
You're playing with your life. You know, that's a, you know, that's why he says it involves a risk, because um, this desire to know, uh, this assumption that if you knew more, you would attain something good. It also involves an assumption about what the world is like and your ability to develop a relationship with it, which is mutually beneficial, which is prosperous. What happens if the answers aren't like that? What if uh, what if the truth turns out to be ugly, or at the very least have the body of a lion and tries to eat you? Um, that is dangerous, and you don't attain that danger by engaging in what I called in the last episode, first order questions, simply asking what the nature of the world is without devolving or diving into a kind of psychology, right? Why am I asking these questions? It's a dangerous business. Paragraph 2. How could anything originate out of its opposite? For example, truth out of error, or the will to truth out of the will to deception, or selfless deeds out of selfishness, or the pure and sunlike gaze of the sage out of lust. Such origins are impossible. Whoever dreams of them is a fool. Indeed, worse, the things of the highest value must have another, peculiar origin. They cannot be derived from this transitory, seductive, deceptive, paltry world, from this turmoil of delusion and lust. Rather, from the lap of being, the intransitory, the hidden God, the thing in itself. There must be their basis, and nowhere else. This way of judging constitutes the typical prejudgment and prejudice which gave away the metaphysicians of all ages. This kind of valuation looms in the background of all their logical procedures. It is on account of this faith that they trouble themselves about knowledge, about something that is finally baptized solemnly as the truth. The fundamental faith of the metaphysicians is the faith in opposite values. It has not even occurred to the most cautious among them that one might have a doubt right here at the threshold, where it was surely most necessary. Even if they vowed to themselves de omnibus dubitantum. For one may doubt, first, whether there are any opposites at all, and secondly, whether these popular valuations and opposite values on which the metaphysicians put their seal are not perhaps merely foreground estimates, only provisional perspectives, perhaps even from some nook, perhaps from below, frog perspectives, as it were, to borrow an expression painters use. For all the value that the true, the truthful, the selfless may deserve, it would still be possible that a higher and more fundamental value for life might have to be ascribed to deception, selfishness, and lust. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of these good and revered things is precisely that they are insidiously related, tied to, and involved with these wicked, seemingly opposite things. Maybe even one with them in essence. Maybe. But who has the will to concern himself with such dangerous maybes? For that, one really has to wait for the advent of a new species of philosophers, such as have somehow another and converse taste and propensity from those we have known so far. Philosophers of the dangerous maybe in every sense. And in all seriousness, I see such new philosophers coming up.
So you have a big statement about the future here. There's been a certain kind of philosopher and there will come another kind of philosopher. It says, in all seriousness. Surely the rest of the second aphorism has a very strong tinge of sarcasm. Nietzsche doesn't just reject the content of dogmatism in philosophy, but also the style of philosophy, the style of objectivity, seriousness, of technical self-forgetfulness. He speaks in his own voice and He's very stylish as a writer, but also emphatic in his emotions. And here he makes fun of the kind of naivete, the childish moralism of philosophy. Hitherto, people have been habituated to think that good and evil must be opposites. The high and the low must be opposites. The pure and the impure must be opposites, and therefore unconnected. One thought in the back of this is, he says, the logical operations of the philosophers have been based on this delusion. One thought, therefore, in the back of this is that maybe the core of philosophy, reasoning by the principle of contradiction, is also in need of re-examination. Everybody takes it for granted, it's just common sense, or some people have read it in, say, Aristotle's Metaphysics. But is that enough? Maybe it is in need of re-examination. And the path to that, as you were suggesting, as the first part eventually culminates in, is about psychology. It's about an investigation into the interiority of being human. He started with the problem of the will to truth. What is its value for us? And therefore implied that there's another standpoint. It's like the questionableness of the questions. That implies another standpoint than the standpoint of enlightenment. And here he says these are foreground estimates. You could estimate things differently. These are perspectives from the ground, frog perspectives. Maybe you could look at things differently, presumably from the heights, from a better perspective than the low perspective. That other perspective, that other standpoint, the standpoint from which you can see how questionable our enlightenment is, that would be the philosophy of the future. The philosophy of the future has some kind of connection to the philosophy of the past. As he says in the preface, we should be grateful in a certain way for the suffering imposed on mankind by dogmatism. But the complexity of that relationship starts with the relationship that dogmatism or philosophy itself had to life before philosophy. The people were not always the way they are now. And it is not clear whether it was necessary that they become so, but they have become, for better or worse, enlightened. And now, because they claim not simply for moral reasons, but as scientists or the audience of scientists, that they have acquired truth, they feel sure that they can say that truth and error have nothing to do with each other. That the will to truth and the will to deception are completely to be separated. Again, you see this in the style of Nietzsche. The rhetoric, the question marks, the suggestions, all of these things threaten, in a way, your peace of mind. It's hard to say, what is he saying? What is the claim exactly? Give it to me neat, give it to me straight, as in a technical treatise, or in the phrase of an honest man. That's actually very hard to do. He's full of slippery movement. He seems like he's saying something very strong. Maybe he's not. As he says, maybe philosophers of the maybe, of the dangerous maybe. Maybe that's what we need. He rejects the style, the rhetoric of enlightened people, because that implies somehow that truth and deception have nothing in common, and that the will to truth and the will to deception can have nothing in common. And that strikes Nietzsche as a kind of irresponsibility, strange as it may seem to the ordinary man. First, he says, okay, what if truth and error are much more connected than truth came out of error? That should not be so hard for people to understand, although it's in a certain way annoying, since everybody makes mistakes. I.e., to know that a mistake is already to know what the truth is. To recognize an error as an error requires that you know the truth. Somehow, we are aware of that, but we, so to speak, deny it to ourselves for moral reasons. Because if you thought about it longer, you might come to think that maybe the error was necessary. Maybe it was a necessary step for you to get to the self-awareness. Oh, this is an error, And then therefore the awareness that you've somehow changed your position, changed your perspective, and found something true. But the second juxtaposition he makes, will to truth and will to deception, is something else. Truth and error are not parallel to truth and deception, since at least deception already implies truth. You can't deceive people unless you know what the truth of the matter is. You could be making a mistake, but will to deception means lying to people, means knowing exactly what you're doing. But it also is a much more sophisticated position, and that's part of the point. It is more responsible, strangely enough. There is something in enlightenment that makes people dull, incapable of taking a hint. They wouldn't know what to do with a woman if they saw one. Why? Well, they lack for subtlety and suggestion. They wouldn't know how to gossip either. They wouldn't know how to suspect. And why? Because they themselves would not be openly self-aware, desirous of deceiving. Enlightened people don't have a sense of humor. The truth is not funny to them. But also, it wouldn't occur to them puckishly to make fun of people, to induce mistakes in others. But that you could call practical psychology. Think about what actors do on the stage or something like that. If they can make you laugh or cry on cue, they can work you like a mechanism, like a puppet. That's certainly some kind of knowledge that's built on a desire to deceive. There is therefore the question of self-knowledge, of being human at stake in the will to deceive in a way in which it is not in the will to truth. And it seems like this is something that Nietzsche wants to recover. You have to go into the depths precisely so that you can reach the heights. It's a very Nietzschean formulation. He does not wish to abandon the will to truth, if anything, to radicalize it. He wants to tell the truth about what we really are, but also to tell the truth about how we might achieve what we can really achieve. That is, to Nietzsche, it is not the separation of truth and error, but their connection that shows the power of being human. It is not the separation between will to truth and will to deception, but their connection that shows how much farther we could actually go. Strangely enough, this is an argument from rationality, because if you can connect truth and error, or will to deception to will to truth and so forth, then you are in a position to show the cause. An account of causation always must require figuring out how opposites are connected. Disparate phenomena must come down under the same cause, a certain unity of understanding, but of being also. Something cognitive that's also causal is at stake. That's what will is for Nietzsche. And so he suggests that enlightened people have cut themselves off from the roots of their own life in separating the will to truth from the will to deception and so forth. And he wants to reconnect those things, both in a historical account, how have we gotten here, but also in another way, in a philosophical science that is a psychological science. But of course, that requires clearing up the mess, the understanding dogmatism as the mistake that it was, and overcoming it, not simply getting rid of it. Since it's not a mistake or an error, it is not simply the opposite of the truth. It may be the preliminary to the truth. That you could say is the funny thing that Nietzsche can think about, that there might be such a thing as necessary mistakes, or mistakes that have some kind of necessity to them. Necessity, of course, belongs to science or to the truth, to that which is and always is and is in the way that it is and cannot be in any other way. How could that belong to a mistake? It's a little like saying, that something is a beautiful image or a good joke. Those are all delusions. How could they have something good about them? Well, they could be suggestive, and therefore they could be connected in a strange way to something that is true. But of course, that is not the procedure of the enlightened people. It is not forthright, simple speech, and univocal. It is it is all of that that Nietzsche sets his face against. And it is because it's on the one hand boring, and on the other hand unintelligent. It cannot give a true account of the origins of being human, because it does not look to error as what it is. It does not look to deception as what it is. It does not look to lust as what it is. And that is, in a way, the danger Nietzsche identifies. We have bought our enlightenment at the expense of life. And the time has come, he thinks, to change that, to recover the rights of life. The standpoint from which you can understand that our questions are quite questionable is the standard of life, as opposed to the standard of science or enlightenment.
The need or the necessity which the question is serving is what's at issue here. And in the first paragraph, Nietzsche poses the question, why do we ask these questions? Why do we engage in philosophy? And it's not clear that he answers for himself yet, or for us, the reader, why we're asking them. But here he does offer a reason why the dogmatists engage in philosophy. What is their necessity? What is their will to truth? And you're right that he in a sense is making a comedy of it, because he begins by asking, is it possible, is it possible to believe that selfless deeds that come out of selflessness, or a sunlight gaze out of the sage out of lust? He ramps up their position that there must be this radical division between the transitory, seductive, deceptive, and paltry, which consists of delusion and lust, from the truth. But of course, life is seductive and transitory, and quite often deceptive, most usually paltry, and if it's in any way healthy, full of lust. So, as you said, the truth appears to be, for the dogmatists, a way to escape life. And that's what he's saying. Why do they ask these questions? They ask these questions because they want to escape life. They want to escape from life into being, into the intransitory, into the thing in itself. This kind of motionless serenity that will save them from their lives. That is the reason why they ask these questions. And in doing so, Nietzsche, the ambition here is hard to overstate. He's attacking the most fundamental assumption of logic, that A cannot equal not A. So on the one hand, he's attacking the most fundamental psychological mechanism of philosophers. And then at the same time, in doing so, he's attacking the most fundamental logical assumption people make, which is A cannot equal not A. A thing cannot be its opposite. A thing cannot be the thing that is not it. And he says that in itself is an assumption. It's an axiom. It's a grounding principle, perhaps a very useful grounding principle, perhaps an indispensable grounding principle in some sense for some things. Nevertheless, it is an assumption or a tenet of faith in opposite values. And all other valuations that come from it, delusion is bad, enlightenment is good. Lust is bad, continence is good. Knowing is good, ignorance is bad. They all flow from this original assumption, this original valuation, if you will, that things cannot be other than what they are. And the problem, it seems, with this assumption is that if life cannot be other than what it is, then truth must be outside of life, outside of your desire for something which cannot be sated, or your mistake in being seduced into something which is not doesn't really have the value you think it has because it's transitory. Your love for a woman who will one day die, your loyalty to a country that one day shall perish, your engagement in your own life is a thing of value, of meaning, of purpose, when at the same time it by necessity is going to pass on and most likely be forgotten. You're being seduced into something transitory, into something that in a certain sense might be considered paltry. And the fundamental assumption of opposites necessitates no, that's not where the truth is. The truth is outside of your lust for a woman, outside of your love for your country, outside of your connection to your own life, your ambition, outside of life. It's a fundamental tenet of faith of philosophers.
Yeah, and Nietzsche was the first to announce the age in which we still live, which we could call postmodern, in the sense that it comes after modernity, that is after the great conspiracy of enlightenment. It starts with doubts. And as you're saying, it can be your country, it can be your religion, it can be your family, your loves, your friends. All of these things come into doubt. A sort of shadow passes over educated mankind, makes them sort of miserable. And every step of the way, every step into this deepening shadow, they become prouder in a way of themselves. People today still believe that for all the weird things that are happening, somehow science has an authority over them. You will find people who think they are very intelligent say at the same time that science is, judging as best as objectively you can the motions of matter, even if that matter should be subatomic particles. And on the other hand, that science has a kind of paradise of its own in which it lives, and it is unaffected itself by these material realities. People who believe that science is just matter, it's the study of matter in motion, if you will. How do they justify their belief in mathematics, in logical principles? Surely those things are necessary, but they are not materialistic. There is no way to square the reasoning we do in the sciences with the fact that we do reasoning, or that we are the ones who do it. Neither aspect of self-knowledge. What is the being of a number? What is the reality of mathematics that compares with the reality of the force fields that we talk about in the sciences, let's say? The reality of the genes. Is that the same as the reality of the mathematics? How are they both real if one seems, by the standard of the other, completely non-material, and the other one seems, by the standard of the one, completely unintelligible? And yet we have mixed them, and we're sure that both go together perfectly. This is madness. People do not react to it like Nietzsche does by re-examining the question entirely, which I think is the rational thing to do for all of Nietzsche's irrationalism as a doctrine. But instead, mad people turn into something worse, a kind of psychopathy, where they do not re-examine the problem. They simply assume that the problem is its own solution. We'll do more of this science, and eventually then we will know. You can somehow marry, for example, the materialism of the physics with its mathematical character as a science by presupposing, say, strings and perhaps the infinity of universes. This is a kind of madness that can only come out of an anguished, misunderstood, but natural madness. That is, madness, you would say, is just disagreement between your efforts and your outcomes. But if you end up thinking that the outcomes simply have to bend or don't matter, then you invent this new or worse kind of madness, this kind of psychopathy. There was a time when people were innocent in their materialist science. Now they are no longer innocent. Postmodernism means that actually you have to believe in it, even though it's obviously absurd. It does not produce the progress you want, and it does not stand up under its own theoretical scrutiny. Is it materialism or is it some kind of discourse, a science? Is it independent of being human or not? What is the opposites? What is that based on? How can both be true at the same time? Think about, or in biology, in evolutionary theory. Is evolutionary theory an evolutionary fact, an advantage of adaptation of some kind? Or is it simply a truth, irrespective of life and of the striving for evolution? Is it simply theoretically sound, or even false, simply theoretical in character? Or is it, like everything else, part of the striving of life for life? Which of the two is it? How can, on the basis of, how can we, on the basis of the materialism of modern science, save the non-materialism of science as such? How can we still say that there are these opposites? This is Nietzsche's attack here. People, smart people are not going to tell you they believe in heaven and then God will protect their souls. They believe instead in science and a method that will protect their reasoning. And that strikes them as particularly a more intelligent way of going through life and obviously self-justifying. But it's not. If you accept the materialism of modern science, and Nietzsche seems to have accepted it, then you must radicalize the attack on enlightenment and deny that there can be an independent basis for all of the posits of modern science. All of them have to be rethought. There must be restored unity, and therefore a real science that is a real account of causes. And that means showing out of what does human reasoning come. It cannot come out of itself. And if you refuse to posit a God who put it into you or something like that, or Platonic forms that are just there, then you have to say, how did life come out of maybe non-life? How did human beings with thought come out of non-thinking beings? How does a thing, in short, come out of its opposite? How do all the beautiful, enlightened things come out of their ugly, unenlightened, crazy origins?
Yeah, I think you raise a great allegory with the question of evolutionary theory, because if it turns out that evolutionary theory is counter-evolutionary, meaning that it actually, having come up with this theory, we are less likely to survive, then the theory would disprove itself. Or it would prove that truth is bad for life. Either way, I mean, it has to be one or the other. And there's a certain sense in which that's true of morality as well, right? That how these principles which we think need to be imposed on life, that in a certain sense are supposed to make life better because they're different from life, right? They're outside of life. How can that be true if they're outside of life? If morality is not what is instinctive and what's natural and what happens on its own, then would it not destroy life? Would it not cause life to die, living beings to die? But if it causes them to live, then in what sense can we say that what is moral is the thing that is not life or not instinctive? And of course, this is an attack on Kant, but he makes a big distinction out of that. But I guess maybe we won't go into it right now. Section 3. After having looked long enough between the philosopher's lines and fingers, I say to myself, by far the greater part of conscious thinking must still be included among instinctive activities. And that goes even for philosophical thinking. We have to relearn here, as one has had to relearn about heredity and what is innate. As the act of birth deserves no consideration in the whole process and procedure of heredity, so being conscious is not in any decisive sense the opposite of what is instinctive. Most of the conscious thinking of a philosopher is secretly guided and forced into certain channels by his instincts. Behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, too, there stand valuations, or more clearly, psychological demands for the preservation of a certain type of life. For example,
Physiological demands.
physiological demands for the preservation of a certain type of life. For example, that the definite should be worth more than the indefinite, and mere appearance worth less than truth. Such estimates might be, in spite of their regulative importance for us, nevertheless mere foreground estimates, a certain kind of niaiserie, which may be necessary for the preservation of such beings as we are, supposing, that is, that not just man is the measure of all things.
So you see here, he seems to accept modern, the modern science of biology as it was developing in the second half of the 19th century, the question of heredity. And he indeed shows in this paragraph above all to what extent he is the father of modern psychology. That is to say, the investigation into that which is not conscious. He doesn't have the shallowness of modern psychology, which is like modern biology. I've heard very successful or famous evolutionary theorists say, well, you know, there's evolutionary theory, and this is these sorts of things about how organisms might behave to safeguard themselves, to really, after all, it's just genes trying to reproduce themselves. But because we know that, we don't have to behave that way. Science turns out to just mean bad manners, and we shouldn't behave that way. That doesn't strike me as a scientific attitude, first of all, but it's not a proper understanding of science either. But that you could say is perhaps the death trap of liberalism, as committed to human specialness, human rights maybe, and on the other hand, as committed to a science that has to establish what human even means. You come to a contradiction where the science of being human can define no rights. And on the other hand, the commitment to human specialness is the only thing that keeps science going anyway. That is the university, the highest creation of the modern liberal regime of enlightenment, is the very place where the belief in the liberal regime of enlightenment is being destroyed by every scientific advance and also by every failure of science to advance. You either get progress and it turns out it's not what you thought it would be, it cannot ground any human specialness, or on the other hand, you do get progress and, pardon me, or you don't get the progress, in which case you're a failure. But either way, modernity seems to be self-refuting. This is the sort of thing that is driving Nietzsche, not simply to reject, but to radicalize modernity, to come up with not the opposite of the science of heredity or biology, but a better version of it. One that takes seriously the need to derive everything that we experience from the realities that we can observe as scientists. And the difference to the typical materialism of modern science is that he is not reductive. He does not want to hide the scientist from the picture of science. He would like to, as you say, instead turn things around and say, what is that scientist doing there? The guy is pretending he's not even in the picture. What is he doing there? And in looking at that creature, this fascinating creature, this self-forgetting creature, he wants to say how much of what these people are even doing is conscious. Maybe their thinking is not that conscious either. It might be that most of what the highest thinkers, not the losers of academia or like bureaucracies of the mind, not those people, the philosophers themselves, what if even what they're doing is largely instinctive? What if it comes out of physiological needs? This beautiful flower of philosophy, what is the dirty ground out of which it grows? How can you put the two together? What is underground and what is overground? To restore the unity of this one being, the human being, at least in this highest specimen, the philosopher. Well, you would need to look at the physiology. You would have to say, it's not obvious that the definite is worth more than the indefinite. That is, that which you have come up with then that out of which you came up with it. You must somehow rebalance the relationship between your constructive thought and the maybe chaos out of which you constructed it in the first place. Man must be less self-forgetful, less cut off from life, because otherwise what you end up with is the niaiserie, the little nothings, the sort of fastidious silliness that passes for real thought. That is, Nietzsche wants to get rid of the problem of an academia, an enlightenment that secretly holds on to human self-importance in the most vulgar sense, while denying it full-throatedly in all its pronouncements. It's the atheists who tell you, life has no meaning, being human isn't special, but clearly they're animated by the feeling that they are special, if only for saying that. It's the scientists who tell you, it's just a universe of billions of galaxies, your place doesn't matter, this planet doesn't matter, none of us matters, except it matters that they should say so. There's a hidden self-importance, which is incredibly crass. There you can see the ugliness of the desire for importance, since it is precisely at opposites with its pronouncements. But what if it were possible, on the other hand, to be as emphatically oneself, as the most self-important person, and yet not sacrifice the connection between that desire and what one thinks? That would be what Nietzsche is trying to achieve through his rhetoric and through his teaching. He is emphatically Nietzsche as a writer, not just another guy publishing in just another journal, working in just another department, in just another school. He's emphatically himself always. But that emphatic particularity or even individuality is also to do with his teaching, with the importance of life. And the taking responsibility for that life seems to be what replaces scientific objectivity. It's not about pretending that the scientist isn't part of his picture. It's instead an attempt to say, the scientist should say on what basis in life his efforts are even grounded.
And he uses this metaphor of the birth, the pregnancy and the birth. That's another very central metaphor for him. It comes up multiple times in this book and other books. It's also in Plato. Viewing thought not as this disembodied activity that we do, which is opposite and disconnected from our bodies, rather as a moment of birth, meaning the result of a long internal process, a process which we do not on the face of it have access to, and perhaps we can devise certain ways to gain access to it. But setting that aside, consciousness and thought, moralizing, scientific activity as the result of an aggregation, reconfiguration, a certain system of instincts, of physiological demands, of different organs working together, the brain and the heart and the blood system and oxygen coming through the lungs. All these things are necessary for thought. And we have this kind of naive view that the brain and the lungs and the heart can all serve thought and yet in no way influence thought. The thought is not influenced. And in fact, you get with some kinds of intellectuals this disembodied being, that has no spine, has no testicles, that is constantly both in their habits, in the way they live their life, but also in the very way they think of themselves. They glorify themselves as a brain in a vat. And aesthetically, you may find that repugnant. I certainly do. But Nietzsche is going beyond that and saying, it's childish. How could it ever be that the brain can function, can do thinking completely independent of the fact that the brain is a living organ? And so too for the rest of your physiology. And must it not be the case that these conscious thoughts that we are producing are expressing subterranean, instinctive, subconscious, unknown, non-thinking things? Is thought not a result of non-thought? At least in some way, maybe not totally, but maybe yes, totally. And it opens up a question. If these are physiological demands, and if we have different physiological constructions, is it not the case that we will think differently? That not everybody thinks the same? I mean, this is, again, an extremely ambitious barrage against Platonism, against the tradition of philosophy, which assumes that the forms are eternal, unchanging, outside of the cave, probably outside of the body. And that to interact with them is a kind of apotheosis, transcendence, a moving beyond life. What does that word life mean? It means that you are a body, you are a living organism. I shouldn't use the word living to define life, but that you have biological needs, that you have emotions that flare through different parts of your corpus, and that these things may work together, but not necessarily always harmoniously, and that they can suffer, and that they can make mistakes. And the thought is somehow it needs to be incorporated. It needs to be immanentized as a living thing, as a material thing, not merely a living thing, not merely a material thing, but as a thing that happens in the world that we populate and not outside of the world that we populate. And that because it happens there, it cannot be completely unrelated, completely unaffected. It makes no sense. It's completely illogical in itself to assume that logic is independent of the beings who walk around logicizing. It doesn't make any sense. Section 4. The falseness of a judgment is for us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. In this respect, our new language may sound strangest. The question is to what extent it is life promoting, life preserving, species preserving, perhaps even species cultivating. And we are fundamentally inclined to claim that the falsest judgments, which include the synthetic judgments a priori, that's a reference to Kant again, are the most indispensable for us, that without accepting the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the purely invented world of the unconditional and self-identical, without a constant falsification of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. That renouncing false judgments would mean renouncing life and a denial of life. To recognize untruth as a condition of life, that certainly means resisting accustomed value feelings in a dangerous way. And a philosophy that risks this would by that token alone place itself beyond good and evil.
So, as you were saying, it's necessary to abandon a kind of science or a kind of manner of thinking, a kind of logic that is based on a sort of terror of life and abandonment of life. And part of the process of doing that is to start seeing the good that might come out of the falseness of judgment, but also the extent to which falseness of judgment is constitutive to life. The two things are very much connected. And so you can see that in this first part, the Prejudices of the Philosophers, as I said, he articulates a certain kind of new philosophy. It starts with the will to truth and philosophy or thought as such, and he moves on to the problem of its origins and the problem of opposites in general. Out of what do things come? Not out of their opposites, or if out of their seeming opposites, then what they come out of is what you get around to saying is that the thing is somehow the opposite of its origin. That's in some sense true, but in a more fundamental sense, it's not. And so that requires a kind of reintegration in terms of genesis, the origin of a thing and its genealogy. And from then on, he moves to criticizing or cutting the philosophers down to size as themselves creatures of their own origins, as themselves the conscious efflorescences of unconscious buildup, the voices of physiological demand. Continuously, he is articulating this new kind of materialism, this new kind of science, this new kind of physiology, and therefore a need to accept that falseness itself is somehow built into what we do. Now, I think you could say that the ordinarily intelligent and the decent man would say, well, yes, of course, the body has an effect on your thinking. But if you think about it, primarily that effect is privative. I'm too tired to think. I'm too angry to think. I'm too sad. I can't do this right now. I don't feel up to it. It's life is forever failing the demands of thought in that sense. Wherever it makes itself felt, it is a failure. It is privative. It is suffering. And so it would seem that only when you feel nothing at all can you really be sure that you're thinking. That may sound like a mere caricature of objectivity, but it's not. What he gets to here in the fourth aphorism is the uses of falsehood. And under falsehood, he seems to include most of what we consider rigorous thought, a constant falsification of the world by means of numbers. And without that, we couldn't live. And we can know that. And so we might as well accept it, but we should accept it knowingly. We should abandon our innocence. It was innocent to believe that the numbers are pure and we're impure, that the knowledge is pure and our bodies or feelings are impure. We have to let go of that innocence. We have the experience, and in a way now we have a new need, since the rejection of life can lead to terrifying consequences. That's, if from a certain point of view, that's very funny, that thinkers are what they are out of their weakness, i.e. they are terrified of life. But the consequences of what they have done, those consequences are terrifying. In the attempt to escape life, we might end life. That's the epitome of irresponsibility. Sort of to say that people are petty individually, but together they are a blind giant that might do terrifying things. And so there is a need, there's an urgency to Nietzsche's teaching, to his broadcasting, just shouting out to the world, come one, come all, maybe. We are in trouble and we need to rethink things. Now, Beyond Good and Evil is pitched at a much higher level than many of his other writings. But even here, the urgency of transforming world history, of seeing the problem we've come to and overcoming it, is the emotional, rhetorical drive of the book as a whole. We're digging into the depths to figure out what this problem is, because it needs solving. This is not merely an exercise in curiosity. It's not merely the virtues of Nietzsche as an analyst of souls. It's a matter of life and death. And here, for the first time, he talks about life in this more complicated sense. There's life promoting, life preserving, species preserving, and maybe even species cultivating. It's the first time he introduces a distinction between individual and species. It's a problem in biology. I'm surely biological, but so is the species. But the species is not conscious in the way I am conscious. And on the other hand, I am not able to survive in the way in which the species can survive. That individual species problem is somehow fundamental to being human. There are individuals in other species, but they're not that individual. Now, I would say that part of that is our falsification of the world. Maybe every ant in some sense matters, but not to us. Don't think of ants, trees. Up until one falls on your car, then this tree it matters in its individuality, in its particularity, so to speak. But that's coincidental maybe. But the point is that to cultivate the species, to look for the survival of the species, is taking responsibility for life, not only in one's own nature, but nature as such. And it requires making judgments about what is enhancing of being human, and therefore also being aware of what is detrimental. And this is, of course, something that has become absolutely intolerable to talk about, the cultivating the species. You can do that to roses or fruit. You're not, and although people are worried about GMOs anyway, and genetic modifications, but what people do in Silicon Valley to select embryos, the Elon Musk method of reproduction, that's actually deeply unpopular. And even in academia or among the educated class, people would be quite scared or squeamish about it, although nobody will legislate on this. There is no, somehow it's impossible to talk about, but nobody will act on it on the other hand. We can't ban genetic research, but we won't talk about improving the species. It's that's, if you say, the moral intellectual sclerosis and the trap we have placed ourselves in. It's a version of the liberal trap I mentioned in relation to the previous aphorism. But I am aware of how dangerous this is. Now, on the other hand, there is a power to the argument. Whatever one might say about what one ought to do with the powers of genetic research and manipulation. On the other hand, the power of the argument Nietzsche makes goes beyond that, because it would put that into question too. Nietzsche is some kind of geneticist and as a genealogist. He's not merely telling the story of mankind. He's also interested in the biology, as is obvious and will become more so. But he would not say that our geneticists or Elon Musks are above the delusions of the age or of the people. He would say that they epitomize those delusions. They are the most successful at falsifying the world through numbers, obviously, but they are the most successful also in a strange, unacknowledged way of falsifying the world through thinking about the unconditional. When Elon Musk talks about making the human being multiplanetary species, or the human species somehow coextensive with the cosmos, he's not talking about practical issues, survival of mankind. He's actually talking about the unconditional humanity as such, the Kantian thing in itself, if you. He may not be aware of it, but that's what it is. For Nietzsche, both issues, the genetic and the genealogical, the scientific issue in the materialist sense and the scientific issue in the higher sense of what is science even. What does it mean for human beings to think? Out of what does thought come and to what does thought lead? Those two things must be understood together. That is what it would mean for philosophy to go beyond good and evil, to begin to make judgments about life that are not merely political judgments or delusions, but are self-consciously, nevertheless, judgments, i.e. the use of reason to decide particulars. And here it begins to be obvious that Nietzsche's intention in Beyond Good and Evil is to propose a teaching that could be useful to rulers, that could be useful to the rulers of thought, but the rulers of action as well, the rulers of mankind. He is playing the part of a philosopher to the kings of the world. And then so I'll say briefly a word about the structure of the book too. This is unique among Nietzsche's books because it has a very clear structure. The first three parts are theoretical. The last 6 parts are practical. Or at least the last 5. There's a strange connection of the two that we will get to in part 4. But that means that most of the discussion of the practical things we have to leave for, some of it is in chapter 9, part 9. And then if you just look at the table of contents, what we're talking about now is the prejudices of the philosophers. We'll talk about the free spirit or free mind. These are theoretical concerns, even the religious. He's not talking about religion, which would be a practical thing. He's talking about the religious phenomenon or man. That's a theoretical question. Whereas in part two, he talks about people's fatherlands, virtues, and the noble. Those are all practical concerns. That is, they are a matter of educating judgment and of making new judgments, i.e. reasoning about the particulars. Here, we are still reasoning in a way about universals, about a species, about life, about being human, about science or knowledge. So much of what he means to say about these things will come out much later, say in aphorism 260 rather than aphorism 4. But when we get there, you will see the connection. And here he is only introducing the notion that knowledge must take responsibility for life. And so, although he starts by saying the falseness of a judgment, not necessarily an objection, it could still be good for us, but that implies a higher responsibility for what judgment and knowledge and falsity and truth imply. It's a little like saying, well, the way we raise our kids is not the way we talk to each other as adults, because we know the power of necessity of falseness. But how do you do that for mankind? Very complicated matter. But you can always look to these kinds of experiences and see he's not entirely out of connection with our way of life, but he radicalizes elements that we would always want to push down, where we would like to hide our doubts or our weaknesses. He shoves questions and points at them the brightest light he can shine on them.
Yeah, that raises a really big problem with Nietzsche, a really difficult problem. If thinking is, at least in some sense, a result, I don't want to say a direct function of physiological drives, because that would not be correct, but highly affected by physiological drives, then it would seem that it is not good to think of thinking as separate from physiology. That your thinking, you're listening to this podcast right now, your reading of Nietzsche, you're asking yourself these questions, is not disconnected from your drive for sex, your drive for food, and various other physiological needs. That you are driven to this activity, thought, because of those drives. But we know in Genealogy of Morals, but also here to a certain extent at the later parts of the book, Nietzsche is very clear that asceticism was essential for developing thought. That putting down the physiological drives is necessary to create an oligarchy of the mind, to free ourselves to think. And this falsehood or this delusion that our thoughts are different from our bodies is species cultivating, or has been species cultivating. We have acquired the ability to think not despite, but because of the Platonic delusion. And this raises a very thorny issue that any person who reads Nietzsche really needs to be attentive to. When Nietzsche says something is wrong, that doesn't mean that he thinks it's bad. And this is a mistake that beginners of reading Nietzsche make all the time. I see it everywhere. I see it constantly. Nietzsche must have not liked Plato because he says that Plato is wrong. Nietzsche must have not liked Christianity because he says that Christianity is wrong. And you could say this for a million different things. Nietzsche must not have liked Schopenhauer because he says Schopenhauer's, like it becomes ridiculous at some point. If you actually read him, it's so clear that he has so much veneration and so much respect for these things. And not just in the sense of, oh, it was impressive, but fundamentally useless. No, on the contrary. its falsehood in no way devalues it and may in actuality be its essential value for life. And it could be that Plato and Schopenhauer and Christianity themselves were extremely essential for life, even though they were false. And everything that Nietzsche, whenever you see Nietzsche saying that somebody was wrong or somebody did a bad thing or somebody made a mistake, you always have to be subtle. You have to be paying attention. Does he also attribute cultivation and growth because of this mistake? Because often he does. I'm not saying he always does, but often he does. And this is a fundamental rule for reading Nietzsche. When he's attacking something, you have to be tentative that he might also be, in a backhanded way, building it up and complementing it. So that's one thing. And here in particular, this leads to an even deeper problem with Nietzsche. If it is the case that we have developed this understanding of truth that is contrary to life, if that is the case, one, that must have come out from some life drive, that life turned against itself for some reason, and that our pursuit of things that are disconnected from life is itself a part of life, not external to life. That's one problem. And problem number two, Nietzsche's philosophy is wholly committed to trying to demonstrate that life is its own value, and that the trap that thought so far has seduced us into is thinking that life is less valuable than truth. On the other hand, Nietzsche never, ever, ever gives up the pursuit of truth. He himself is wholly committed to the pursuit of truth. So that when you say he is engaged in shining a bright light on these very difficult questions, he almost appears to be doing the opposite of what he says he's doing. Because the idea that certain judgments that we have them not because of ourselves, but because they're good for the species, and because they're species cultivating, is extremely dangerous for us as a particularity. You might recognize that nothing in your life has value, that you are only acting out the instinct of a species, and that would radically threaten who you are, your own understanding of your own life, your own ability to live your life. And Nietzsche is not in any way interested in shielding you from that. In The Gay Science, he says the experiment is to see how much truth life can handle. Right? So on the one hand, yes, we are now saying actually these false judgments, they might be really important and good, and we're not opposed to falsehood. We're just not. If a falsehood is conducive to life and cultivates life, then it can be judged a good falsehood. But at the same time, Nietzsche himself never says life is more important than truth and we should seek falsehoods. And that's not what he's engaged in. It's on the contrary. He is constantly engaged in demonstrating how things that are usually assumed are actually falsehoods and the truth is different. And he is testing or experimenting. What happens if we induce more truth into life? Will that destroy life? Can life handle that? Can you handle learning these very, very difficult, wicked truths? Or will it cultivate you? Will it preserve you? Will it make you into something stronger, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's the saying. If you can survive it, if you can survive the truth, then perhaps it would be a species cultivating. And so the entire distinction between falsehood and truth of a judgment becomes extremely murky, right? Because there are certain judgments that we will accept if they're species cultivating, but if the truth is species cultivating, then we're willing to do that even if it's difficult, harmful, painful, because it's species cultivating. And so in the one sense, there is this value life. In a second sense, there's this value truth. And then there's this third value cultivation or growth development, which we'll get to later in the book. And so it's a very thorny issue. I don't think that there are simple answers to where Nietzsche falls on it, because I don't think he wants it to be a simple answer. But I think it is important to remember that if he says something is false, that doesn't mean it's bad. And if he says something is true, that also doesn't mean it's bad. And he's not always engaged in deceiving you. Sometimes he's engaged in revealing the truth, although it may be the case that sometimes he's engaged in deceiving you.
Yeah, it is a very artful presentation that is justified ultimately by the thought or the hypothesis at this point, we're just beginning, that there's no other way to do it. Other ways, enlightenment, have been tried and they are a failure. In fact, they are a danger to the species. They are tempting more and more people to abandon life. And I think you only need to look at the world around us to see that this is still an ongoing catastrophe. It has not been solved or just disappeared by, I guess, great good luck. That problem of the late 19th century is this problem now. And in fact, we are much more likely these days than they were in those days when it was fresh to just say, oh yeah, nihilism. There's a lot of nihilism. There is. It's a big problem. But somehow we've grown comfortable with it. It's really, which is why, strangely enough, it's now necessary to return to the past, to Nietzsche, and to see what this problem looked like when it was announced as the catastrophe of mankind. Mankind has somehow, and we have to find out how, through genealogy, gotten into this problem. That there even is a possibility for mankind to come to this problem, that life could abandon life, in short. Needs explaining, as you were saying. And therefore, there is a strange uniqueness to being human. But if one were to say man is the animal that can commit suicide, that seems both true and a very dubious distinction. Should we be proud of that? It doesn't sound like it. And so it is that crisis that justifies this rhetoric and this new presentation of philosophy and of the search for the truth that has to be in a way chastised and in another way strengthened by all of these ugly truths, by all of these attacks. And that has to do, on the one hand, with the deceptions of the style, and on the other hand, with, as you were saying, Plato was, it looks like, Nietzsche's favorite enemy. From the beginning to the end of his career, he never tired of saying that asshole Plato. But it seems like it provoked him to think more than anything else did. That's surely a great compliment, at least if you take Nietzsche at his own valuation. If Nietzsche's opinion of himself was in any way justified, then his choice of Plato as antagonist also raises Plato to that level. And of course, that has to do with another aspect of what it means to go beyond good and evil. The question for Nietzsche is not primarily, as you were saying, it's not, is Plato good or evil? The question is he a worthy enemy? Is this that by which you should reckon and against which you should reckon in order to achieve the greatest thing you can ever achieve? And then it becomes more obvious that that is a great compliment, but that it requires a strange shift in perspective, i.e., it's not enough to get rid of the thinking itself. It's not enough to get rid of the fantasies of objectivity. It is also necessary to affirm strife, to say that only in striving and only in strive do we come to be aware of ourselves in our powers, develop them, cultivate them, achieve the most that we can achieve. And only that, on the other hand, can justify this incredibly bellicose critical rhetoric. Why are you being so aggressive? Because this is the character of our situation. And this is also, in a certain sense, the character of education at all times. Mankind should be, in a sense, counting itself lucky to have suffered under the tyranny of dogmatism, of Platonism for millennia. And Nietzsche certainly counts himself lucky to be in the great position to have Plato as an antagonist. There are much worse enemies one could have, something like that. And since with aphorism 4, he has expressed what the philosophy of the future has to do with going beyond good and evil, I think we can end our episode here and continue his reevaluation of the philosophers and their prejudices next week. All right, Hadar, this has been very satisfying in a way. Thank you for the conversation. a lot of things have come up that I had not thought of in my preparation. So what I mean by saying it was very satisfying. It's a very pleasant surprise. And I'm sure that our audience will also find things that they hadn't seen coming. And we are, I think, fairly sure to find more in our next episode.
Looking forward.
And all the best until then, Hadar. Take care.